trying just really quickly to connect what Julie has spoken about with what I'm going to do. I'm very interested in this notion that privacy could play a role in the shaping of selves through things such as play. Nietzsche once famously said that human maturity consists in having found once again the seriousness of a child at play. And when I think about things like Facebook and this notion of self-shaping, I think that there's much to be protected here. And so I hope to actually connect that idea of privacy as playing a role in this sort of way through the shaping and managing of boundaries, which was another of Julie's main points. But I'm going to talk about it sort of through a very different style, perhaps more of one that my colleagues would recognize as a bit of my playfulness. And so my title is called The Devil is in the Defaults. And so there's this sort of small movie that's going around in North America. You probably haven't heard of it in Israel. Probably you've never heard of Facebook or Mark Zuckerberg or any of this stuff, right? Obviously, I'm just joking. And so you maybe think when I have the title "The Devil is in the Defaults" that I'm somehow referring to this in a kind of way. This is my pre-Halloween picture of Mark Zuckerberg. Anyways, actually what I'm really referring to is this, and that is the settings that are used to define some of these boundaries about how information is shared and disclosed on Facebook, the privacy settings. And that is really going to be the focus of what I talk about. And so it's interesting, if you look at Mark Zuckerberg's own profile on Facebook and you look at what he sort of puts as his aspirational quote, he says, "I'm trying to make the world a more open place by helping people connect and share." And so this is sort of part of this so-called cultural ethos of sharing and transparency and openness, all of these things that some people claim threaten privacy, but I agree with Julie, it ought not to. And Zuckerberg, about a year ago, was sort of misquoted, I think, to say that privacy is no longer a social norm. So in any event, in sort of thinking this through, here's what he actually said. I'm not sure if the sound that I'm about to play is going to cause great feedback in the room or if it's going to even work, but let's see if this video, he didn't really say that. He said this. He's asked in this conference what will happen if he, what impact will Facebook have on privacy? And he sort of says, well, you know, when we started Facebook in my college room in Harvard, in my dorm room, we thought that people wouldn't actually even put anything up on the internet. Why would they put stuff about their personal lives up? But when we got it up there, we realized that people were really open to all of this, and they were really willing and sharing and disclosing all of this stuff. And so that's just a social, cultural norm that's just evolved over time. Okay, that's instead of my video. And it raises a question of what's going on here. And the question is, does Facebook merely reflect these changing, shifting cultural norms? Or is there something else going on here? Is Facebook, in fact, trying to engineer new social norms through its architecture, through its business model? And if that's the case, if the latter is the case, what should the law have to say about this? These are the things that I'm interested in thinking through the Facebook model. So when it comes to Zuckerberg, if you did see the movie, one of the things that the movie doesn't really emphasize that I think is important to know is that he's actually a really good coder. The reason he did Facebook wasn't so much about the idea of what the network would allow as much as he was just really good at programming this stuff. And so I think when you think about Facebook, you have to think about code, this notion that was made famous years ago through Larry Lessig's book, Code and Other Laws of Cyberspace. And really start thinking about, as Julie, I imagine, does in her book from the title and from what I know of her work, thinking about the interaction between architectures and norms of a social sort. And so just quickly borrowing from Lessig, who I think has more of the old-style liberal model of self there, because the self is just this pathetic dot, as he refers to it. That's his language, the pathetic dot, which is acted upon by these outside forces and perhaps sheltered from them, etc. And he talks about these four forces. I'm just going to very quickly run through them for those who aren't familiar with it. But he basically says you can regulate people's conduct through markets, through norms, through law, through code. And so, for example, if we were trying to stop people from smoking, which it seems to me people do more of in Israel than in Canada, one of the things we could do is we could change that through the market. In Canada, there's a huge tax on cigarettes, so it's very expensive to smoke. We could also do it through social education. My sister's kids, when they were little, had this poster of this duck with a cigarette in its mouth, like the bird, like a duck. And it looked really silly, and underneath it said, "Smoking's not cool." And I thought it was a great poster because it sort of showed kids how this looks from a different perspective. We can also, of course, change the laws around smoking. In Canada, we have laws that it's illegal to sell cigarettes to a person under a certain age. But most importantly for our purposes here, says Lessig, we can also change it through the architecture of code. In this case, he's thinking of things like changing the actual chemistry of the nicotine, so that by actually changing the architecture of what we're talking about here, it can have an effect. And so what I'm really interested in this conversation is how, if we think about code as a regulator, how might we also have law regulating the code which is used by people like Zuckerberg, I would say, to shape some of the social norms around information disclosure. And just as a very quick example of that, made famous by the great philosopher of technology, Langdon Winner. This is Robert Moses, and he was one of the main city planners for what is the modern-day New York, and there he is with a model of some of the bridges going out of the city. What Robert Moses knew all too well, but isn't necessarily known by everybody about him, is that he could use these notions of architecture to change social norms. So he was developing this exclusive beach called Jones Beach, sort of out towards the Hamptons on Long Island. And he wanted it to stay exclusive. So when he designed the roadways, he designed overpasses like this. They look pretty standard. It's a very self-effacing sort of sand-colored overpass. But if you look really closely, one of the things you'll notice about that overpass is that it's a very low overpass. And what he recognized is if he built these things low enough, public transport buses couldn't go under them. And if he was also able to change the zoning laws around the railways, he could prevent people from getting out to this area at all who were of a certain socioeconomic class. So he understood all too well this idea that we can use the architecture of things as a way of shaping the social norms. A more modern example would be Bez, right? Amazon.com and the Kindle. And many of you will perhaps know this story about what happened about a year and a half ago. There was some issues around copyright, as there often are, in the context of particular ebooks. And in particular, the problem had to do with these two books, ironically, George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, because it was in the public domain in some countries but not in others. Amazon was selling copies available for download, and there were certain publishers that were really putting pressure on Amazon that they weren't doing the right thing on a copyright perspective. So what did Jeff Bezos do? He recalled, he auto-deleted all of the copies of these books from every Kindle reader after they'd paid for them, bought them under a license, the whole thing, just by the click of a button. And so he electronically seized all of these books, kind of like the line in George Orwell about how we would be remaking the truth through all of these different media. So it was an ironic kind of moment. The point here that I've been making so far is a fairly straightforward one. It's the point that design and design of the architecture matters. In the privacy discourse, there is a number of people who consider themselves what they call privacy pragmatists, who aren't as interested, let's say, in the niceties of privacy theory as they are in design. One such person is in Jerusalem right now. She's Anne Kavukian, the Ontario Privacy Commissioner. I don't know if she got a trademark on this, but she's really heavy on this logo, which stands for privacy by design. The lawyers want to look like chemists. So this is privacy by design, and if you look at the principles, and I'm not going to sort of spend a lot of time on them, but the main one that I want to focus on is principle number 2 from her list, where she says that we ought to set privacy as the default. This means that if individuals do nothing, their privacy should remain intact. I think it's a fairly straightforward kind of claim about how you would approach privacy, and I actually think that anybody who's serious about privacy would try to implement that principle as well as some of the others, including some of the ones that I've got listed here. I guess my thesis that I'm arguing, not fully for today, but in a Canadian context, is that the privacy by design approach is aspirationally correct, but it's insufficient. I think we need to actually legislate this notion of privacy by default, in particular in response to things like what's going on in Facebook. And I want to say that I think that's true in at least some cases, and I want to say a little bit more about why. Canada is actually on the world stage with respect to some of the privacy issues on Facebook, and I think Michael will talk about that more than I intend to. But just very briefly, there was complaints registered in Canada to Canada's Federal Privacy Commissioner, whereupon she launched a large inquiry and investigation into Facebook and made recommendations to Facebook, many of which they took on board, some of which some people in the privacy community think that they haven't really properly addressed, and there's issues about that. But what was interesting, if you sort of looked at this historically, was around the time that they were supposed to respond to the Privacy Commissioner's suggestions in her outcome of her investigation, they changed their architecture. And at the time, Mark Zuckerberg was like, you know, we take privacy seriously. It's a pretty big deal to do a major architectural overhaul for what was at the time 350 million users. Of course, now there's 500 million users. So he took this as an opportunity to say, we listened to the Privacy Commissioner, we took it seriously, and we actually implemented these, not just in Canada, but on a global basis, because they're all important. So this was a moment where he was posturing that they're taking privacy seriously. But what's interesting, if you look at the controls as they were when developed around that time in 2009, what you actually see here is that instead, these so-called enhanced privacy settings were an opportunity for Facebook to do something which I would suggest is very different from being privacy settings. I would refer to them instead as information sharing settings. And the reason why I think that these settings are more appropriately called information sharing settings is because of the way Facebook designed its defaults. So if you imagine the Facebook page of any particular individual and they go into their privacy settings, what they started to see was that some of the settings were now defaulted in some cases, to everyone, so that they were open to the entire internet, Google searchable, and other things, many of them, to friends and networks, and in some cases, friends of friends. And so you sort of go down here, and you can see that that approach, of course, goes against the privacy by design principle. The privacy by design principle says set the defaults at either only me, only I can see it, or only my friends can see it, so that then people, as they're shaping themselves and as they're playing in these atmospheres, can decide and think about how they want to move forward with these kind of things. And you think about it, and I know many of you in the room are on Facebook, and many of you probably even have some of your settings set to such things as let my friends and my friends of friends see this. But I was talking about this with one of my students who has 820 friends. I feel so inferior. I have 300 and something. But for her, if you say that she has 820 friends and the average Facebook user, according to Facebook's own statistics, is the average user has about 120 friends, if you do the math on that, you've got almost 100,000 people seeing those things that were only meant for friends. And that's a big deal, and I don't think many people get that, and that's why I think the default is wrong in that setting. So the effect of the architecture in Facebook is really to broadcast. So you imagine Bella Thompson here posts that she's, you know, as one might on Twitter or Facebook, you know, off to class, chem quiz today, what a drag. That goes to her sister, it goes to her mom, it goes to her grandmother maybe, she's very progressive, and to her dad, but it also goes to her chemistry teacher. Now, why do you say that? Why is she friends with her? She might not be friends with her chemistry teacher, but I'll tell you, a lot of my students are friends with me. And here's the kind of stuff they're saying, and I have their permission to show this to you. And these are conservative law students, upper echelons, working towards serious aspirational goals. This is not the sort of self-shaping that I imagine most of the play that goes on in Facebook to do. But Katie says, you know, this was just something she posted a long time ago. She appreciates the keen tutelage of the dean who teaches her tort law. Apparently, we're all going to die someday. Even better, some of us are going to die young. And so you have this whole banter of all these law students talking about what happened in the torts class, and one saying, oh, it's okay because rock stars die young. I guess we're in trouble. And then one student saying, he is the dean of mean. He crushes dreams for a hobby. Which my colleague Michael Geis can comment on if he wants to. I'll leave it to him. But then, you know, you see this banter carry on in the same group of friends. Another one of my students wonders who would win a cat fight, the Chief Justice of Canada or the Queen of England. And there's this whole discourse on who would win, and they're just playing around. But what's interesting is this particular student has a very good chance of applying for clerkships at the Supreme Court. And it would be very interested to know what would happen if what I'm going to tell you about at the very end, when I finish up in a couple of minutes, would take place with her in terms of some of this information disclosure that's going on. Just as one last example, another student who works with me had a poetic moment referring to her whole law school training in first year. Though this be madness, yet there is no method in it, famous Hamlet quote. And you sort of look at the talk, and it degenerates down to poetry, the man from Nantucket who had this and that and whatever. So you see that, I mean, even what I know to be some of the most brilliant minds of the next generation are engaging in this sort of banter. And quite frankly, 3/4 of the people who are at this privacy conference in Jerusalem are doing much worse versions of this, and I'm watching it happen. And I participate in it, right? So now let's take this back to Facebook. Just last year at the F8 conference, which is Facebook's conference for the application makers, you know, those apps that you use on Facebook, whether you're rating movies or seeing who's your friends that are compatible with you. At that conference, Mark Zuckerberg announced 2 new apps that are going to be key to Facebook. One is called Instant Personalization, and the other is called Open Graph. I don't have much time, so I just want to quickly say something about each of these. The big thing about instant personalization, I mean, according to Zuckerberg, this is going to change the way that the internet works. And I don't think he's full of puffery. I think he's serious about that. The idea would be that people could that Facebook and other social networks could make partnerships with other websites in a way that they could then share information with each other to totally personalize and customize your experience when you go to these other websites. So on the one hand, this reeks of what Nicholas Negroponte called in the mid-90s the Daily Me, which caused Cass Sunstein to write a book called Republic.com about all of the problems that happen when our entire worldview is shaped through the media of a very narrow, homogeneous group of people who surround us, rather than having exposure to a broad range of ideas, which is what instant personalization threatens from the intellectual perspective. But from a privacy perspective, what it threatens is a real serious range of sharing of information, the likes of which we've never seen. And just to give you a sample of this, and I have lectured about this stuff, and it still took me by surprise the first time I saw it. I was on this website. It's a Canadian news site called The Mark. There was a piece there. There was a radio interview that I was involved with on the future of humans. And I noticed in this side panel now that there's all this stuff about all the people I know sharing this article or not sharing this article. And again, this wasn't on my Facebook account where people share articles and there's links back to the Mark. This is on the Mark's website. And I was taken by surprise, again, even though I have lectured on this stuff. And I went back, and then I logged in to the Mark from my wife's computer, and that stuff wasn't there. It was only visible to me because it knew that it was me. And et cetera, et cetera. So we're really going to start to see this kind of interaction that isn't just about the disclosure that the people are putting when they update their status accounts. It's about a much broader kind of sharing and disclosure that really will, I think, play really crucial roles in this so-called shaping of the selves. Open graph, I'll just very quickly say, this notion of a social graph, which many people have been talking about for a while, is this idea that both for very valuable to marketers, but not only to marketers, also to governments, to national security, to potential employers, as I'll finish with in a moment, that what we can start to do, and what Facebook has started to do, is to build the map of connections between us, our friends, our social objects, the things we click, we like, all of these kind of things, and developing a really interesting set of algorithms they say to personally customize the experience on the web for you, but you can think about the other kinds of things that it can also be used to do in terms of information disclosure about you. The way that I try to conceptualize and describe this to somebody who's not really in this space or thinking about this stuff that much, I sort of say, it's kind of like Google Street View. Okay? Google Street View has a camera that goes down every street and magically connects these separate images of everything that's going on, and then has this magical algorithm for threading them together so that what was once a mess of dots becomes the city of Paris. That's what Google Street View's magical technology does. This is the Google Street View of our lives. Right? This is being able to take those same points of connection and connecting them through Open Graph to tell a certain kind of other story about us, or I wouldn't say a story, I would say stories about us, the kind that really do take these things outside of our control. So when it comes to Facebook, Zuckerberg says that the reason that we're making Facebook more open is, and this was in the video clip that I wasn't able to show you, that people have gotten really comfortable not only in sharing more information in different kinds, but more openly and with more people. That social norm is just something that's developed over time. But it's interesting, if you look back at all of the things Mark Zuckerberg has said, as I've worked with some of my students to try to do, just a couple months earlier he said something very contradictory. He said, we decided that these would be the social norms now, and we just went for it. So he's talking about building a new design architecture with a view of getting the norms to be in line with its business model. And so this sort of doublespeak is apparent even from his own Facebook website, right? In December 11th, before they rolled out the new privacy changes, this is what it said on his Facebook profile. Just look in the box there. I didn't see the need to limit the visibility of my own pictures with family, friends, or my teddy bear. There was a famous picture of him that showed up later on the web of him with his teddy bear, which he's hugging as he's smoking some drugs or something like that. So it was kind of ironic that this had sort of come out. But in any event, if you look 2 months later, there's no longer any access to his public pictures. And so Facebook groups have started, and I think Michael's going to talk more about Facebook groups and how they play a role in some of this stuff. Like this group, which I'm a member of, which says whatever the default settings are, Mark Zuckerberg should be on them. And I think that's basically Ann Cavoukian's principle, right? Design the defaults that are most privacy. I mean, this is sort of more like a golden rule version of that. But the idea here is quite clear. If Mark Zuckerberg isn't even using the defaults that he recommends, what does that say about what he's trying to do with Facebook? So the real reason for making Facebook more open, obviously, there's a business interest in making these things more searchable, being able to see these things with Google, competing with models like Twitter, and increasing generally the disclosure of personal information. I'm going to end with that short story. Is it okay if I take 2 more minutes? That I promised you earlier on. I can't tell you who said what because the conversation was held under the so-called Chatham House rules, which means that I'm allowed to report on what happened in a meeting but not identify any of the players. Ironic that a privacy norm is used here to protect the conversation that's taking place here, which is about the diminishing of, ultimately about the diminishing of privacy. But in essence, the closed room conference that I was at, which had all of the big major information brokers, was talking about the subject of both letting employees use Facebook during work hours. Was this a good thing or a bad thing? Are there liabilities we should worry about besides workplace efficiency? And then the second half of the conversation, which is the more interesting one to me, is to what extent could Facebook be used for pre-employment screening? Right? In other words, being able to scrape through somebody's past of what they did on Facebook to know what was on their website, not just now that they're presenting themselves for their interview, but what they had said prior to that that's no longer on Facebook, but could be scraped through various data mining techniques. And what's interesting is that they were having this discussion, and all the lawyers in the room and all the chief privacy officers and some of the CEOs from these big banks, insurance companies, and information service providers, such as the Googles and Facebooks and Twitters of the world, all had the same basic view, which is, look, we should be able to get access to all of this stuff. This stuff is important because, you know, when we hire our employees at our big law firms, it's very important for us to know who they are and what they've done and all of this sort of stuff. And I stood up as one of the token academics there and told them that I thought that this was insane, that they would need this excessive approach to doing their hiring process, that it's completely out of balance with what, generally I think people would expect, have a reasonable expectation with respect to privacy. And I told them this anecdote about how students had come to me 2 months earlier, 3 different students, completely unrelated, each of them showing me this waiver, this disclosure form, and asking my opinion or my advice for it. In each of those cases, an employer wanted to get the student to waive and allow for disclosure through a third-party application provider that does this kind of work for employers so that they could get jobs. And these were jobs in government. These were like Department of Justice type jobs. And what my students absolutely knew was if they didn't sign the waiver, so much for the interview, or if they got the interview, so much for the job. So this was a real problem, and I told this to the representative groups of people in the room, and they said, look, we would never do anything like that. That's not the kind of thing we're interested in here. That was on a Saturday. On the Monday, this headline broke in Ottawa. Why you should never post your vacation pics on Facebook. And it detailed the story of a woman who was on short-term disability leave for depression, who had posted a picture. One of the things one of her doctors told her to do is go away and relieve the stress. She went away, she posted the picture. Obviously, one of the agents investigating the insurance had found her way into her friend list because she had all the privacy settings set to only friends. They got a hold of this picture, and they canceled her insurance without notice, without contacting her. So I say that these are serious issues that need to be addressed. In Canadian law, Facebook is understood, just so you know very quickly, as a document. Right? It's not seen as a place or a space where we live, but seen as a document, and therefore subject to the rules of civil procedure, and therefore it's discoverable. The courts take these kinds of things into account. There's about a dozen cases in Canada on this stuff. I can tell you, anybody who has even read a little bit about privacy reads those cases, and they know the judges are not getting what's going on here on Facebook. Basically, their view is you only have any privacy if you completely restrict access, which is highly problematic in the Facebook context, where the defaults are set as they are. And what's really important to note is that by Facebook's own accord, only 20% of people ever, 20% of 500 million people only ever go and change any of their settings. And independent sources and studies say that it's more like 1%, 1.2%. But we won't quibble. Between 1 and 20% don't ever change these kind of things. So just quickly to mention this as I close here, there's a book by a colleague of ours in the privacy space called Delete. It's an interesting concept. I think it's a bit provocative and a bit controversial. But the nature of the book is about this idea of deleting, and how in a digital age it's much more difficult to delete. And so the subtitle of the book is The Virtue of Forgetting in a Digital Age. And what the author argues for is that there should be mandatory expiration periods. There should be a best before date for personal information, after which these things should automatically disappear. I'm not necessarily suggesting today, and I've certainly not tried to argue for it, that this thesis is correct, but I think just posing the idea is an interesting one. So what I have said is that I think we have to institutionalize privacy by default. I've said I think we need to better understand the culture of these social spaces that we're allowing to be created and the architectures that they have. We need to think about how to regulate in light of the strange relationship between the architectures and the law. And finally, the current emphasis, which I haven't talked about at all, but I think is an important point, the current emphasis on information collection rules, which is where all the action seems to be in the data privacy space. Has to leave room for new rules, I think, about the use of the information once it's collected. It's got to be both about collection, but it's also got to be about what should be the norms of use around these kind of things. Quick shout out to 4 students who've helped me work and think through Facebook using their Facebook pictures. Goldie, Cindy, Katie, and Kristen. And just to be fair, I put one of mine up there too. And my wife was concerned that you would all think that I was dressing up as a pimp. This was a Halloween costume for a party associated actually with a conference on identity and identity formation. Anybody who knows and is a vintage Barbie fan will know that in fact I was dressed up as Mod Hair Ken. So thank you very much. I appreciate your time.